Okay.
And then
When I get started,
you just hit resume.
Okay, will do.
And I think it should be recording. I'm trying to think if it'll show that. Let's see. No, that's the share, but okay. Stop recording. Pause recording.
And Zoom recording. I am. Okay. I'm going to talk about the U.S. National Library of Medicine, and there is a National Library of Medicine in lots of different countries, but the U.S. National Library of Medicine is very special to me, mostly because, as Brenda said, I was involved with it over the years in my career. And what I have done is, let's see. I thought about the fact that it was difficult for anybody to become interested in libraries. When I thought about speaking about a library, I thought everyone's going to fall asleep. So I have inserted a few jokes along the way so that you can come up to speed. And I'm using Bill Thomas's computer, because mine didn't want to connect. And so if it looks like I don't quite know what I'm doing with his computer, it's because I don't. This is a picture of the National Library of Medicine. You can't see too terribly much from that, other than the fact that this is a very large research building, which sits about a block away from it. This is the National Library of Medicine's research building. And this is really an understated library. And that's, I'll tell you about that just as we go forward, why it is so understated as opposed to being like a 15-story building. What I plan to do is to show you the transformation of the National Library of Medicine over the last 35 years, and to say that they are leading library transformation globally. So all of the libraries in the world have been transforming, as you know, but the NLM is really leading the pack. And my involvement, I went from 1976, see, I have a pointer too, there we go, 1976 to 2018. So I was involved with them as a postdoctoral fellow, doing personal research grants later, institutional research grants, including such things as testing telemedicine systems. And you all know during the pandemic that telemedicine systems all of a sudden became really important to us and still are. Looking at advanced integrated information systems, which involve strategic planning at our institution. That was the National Library at the University of Missouri at that particular time. And then leading some institutional training programs for people who were interested in careers in informatics. I did a 2-year sabbatical at the NLM, which was the most marvelous thing in the world. And as Brenda said, I helped to develop and get off the ground the genetics home reference. And I'm not going to show you too much about that because it gets way down in the weeds in things that nobody really, well, Jack Miller and Ann Miller would be interested in, but probably not too terribly many other people along the way. And then I was on committees and review groups with them, etc. Now, what is a library? And this is a definition coming right out of, I Googled it. And this is the most traditional and out of date definition that you can imagine. It is a building or it's a room containing collections of books, periodicals, sometimes films, maybe recorded music, and people will read, borrow, or refer to it. But And when you go into that room, of course, you have to prepare yourself for shelf reading. So that's one of the library jokes. There are 5 US national libraries. When I wrote the little abstract and gave it to Chris, I only thought I knew about 3, but then when I started putting this talk together, I found out that there were 5. The first one you all know, the Library of Congress. It's funded by Congress, of course. It was begun in 1800, and it's the largest library in the world. Many people would like to rename it. Instead of the Library of Congress, they would like to say it's the Library of the US, but that hasn't happened yet. It's the main research arm of Congress, and it houses the US Copyright Office, among other things. Another library, the second one, is the National Agricultural Library that's housed in Beltsville, Maryland. It's under the US Department of Agriculture, and it has as its focus to disseminate information for agricultural challenges today and in the future. And they're doing a lot with climate change, of course, for agricultural challenges. And then these are the 2 new ones. The National Library of Education was only created in 1984, sits under the Department of Education, and the National Library of Transportation, created in 1998, sits under the US Department of Transportation. So here's mine that I'm talking about now, the National Library of Medicine. It was begun in 1818. And it sits under the US Department of Health and Human Services. And Bill Thomas asked me at the table, he said, I'm going to ask you who funds them. And I think maybe that answers your question. Is that right, Bill? Yeah. Okay. They all sit, well, the Library of Congress sits under Congress, of course, which is legislative branch, but all the rest of them are in the executive branch, under the secretaries in the executive branch of our government. So a short history of the National Library of Medicine. It began as a simple bookshelf for the Surgeon General in the US Army Medical Library, 1818. And by the Civil War, it had about 2,000 books. So they moved it to a bank building. It was still under the Army Medical Library, US Army. And then in 1865, one of the remarkable people was designated to be the librarian. He was an Army surgeon, John Shaw Billings. And he moved it to Ford's Theater. So that's what Ford's Theater looks like in 1865. And the reason he could move it to Ford's Theater was because after Lincoln was assassinated, no one wanted to be in Ford's Theater. So it was empty and available. And he said, there's my library. It was the largest medical library in the United States by the time that he retired. And one of the most remarkable things about it was that it was cataloged. And now we think everything, you go into the library and you look at the card catalog, and that was a piece of cake for all of us. But he started cataloging the medical literature and the medical information, and that was remarkable at its time. In 42, it was moved, they moved the old and the rare volumes to Cleveland, and they did that because of the Second World War, because they were concerned that if they bombed Washington, maybe they would bomb the library. And of course, that was Ford Theater downtown. And that set up the History of Medicine division from that point on. In 56, it was renamed to be the National Library of Medicine, and it was moved under HHS. Before that, it had been military. And they developed something called medical subject headings. And medical subject headings is also called MESH. And those were the subject headings that were used to catalog and retrieve information. In 62, they had this new building on the NIH campus. And I'll show you in a minute the Cold War design of that building. It was still in the middle of thinking about, you know, they're going to bomb the library, and started computer-based searches. So, but the computer-based searches were done by trained librarians sitting in front of a teletype or a screen with the library, of course, holdings on the mainframe. So that's been a while ago. They got a new director in 1984, Don Lindbergh, and he actually was the person who had been the director of my training program at the University of Missouri. So that's when I had been involved with that training program, of course, before he moved there. But he was an institution, he was an individual who really transformed the library and brought it forward. So I'm really talking about what happened from 84 forward. Here's another joke. How do librarians file melted marshmallows? According to the Dewey Decimal System. I'm glad you like them.
Yeah.
But public libraries use the Dewey Decimal System. You know, if you go into the any of the libraries around here, you've got your fiction categorized by author's last name, and you've got your nonfiction, which is categorized by the Dewey Decimal System. But if you go into health libraries, medical libraries, they use the MESH system. That's the medical subject headings that I was just talking about, which is a taxonomy of terms for searching information about your healthcare or anything related to the delivery of healthcare or the content of medicine, nursing, etc. Now, I wanted to show you once again this picture of the library and this building up front. And I'm sorry I couldn't get a better one, but better picture. But it's a very understated building. And the first floor you can go in, and it's a place for the patrons to come work with the librarians to search. Of course, it's all computerized inside. You sit at a computer and search. The second floor is the administrative offices, and all of the library content is underground. And so it started out with 50 miles of stacks, library stacks underground. 50 miles, it's way more than that now, at least twice as much. They are these library shelves that are compacted, and they'll move apart if you want to get in there. And hopefully no one will move back together again before you leave. There's not much browsing that is done because they're all underground and they're only accessed by individuals who work for the library and know how to find things down there. And the reason that it has this roof up here, it's a pointed roof, is that if there was a nuclear attack, the roof would collapse down on the library and save the contents of the library. And of course, if the librarians were in there, they would not make it, but the librarians were not as important as the holdings of the library, according to the architect and the people who approved this design. So that's a bit of a story of you know, the Cold War design of these buildings that are in Washington. So the National Library, I said before, is part of the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda. Wayne wanted to know where that was, but if you get on the red line and you go up to Bethesda and you get off at the medical center, you've got Walter Reed on one side of the street, and you've got the NIH, which is a very large campus on the other side of the street, and that's where the National Library of Medicine is. And so it's considered administratively one of the national institutes. The director reports directly to the National director of the National Institute of Health. And they have as their charter all of these various services. But they serve biomedical researchers worldwide and medical communities worldwide, public health communities worldwide, and the public worldwide. And at the same time, they actively conduct research into new methods of informatics and systems. So, which you have to do if you're going to figure out how to do all the rest of those services. Now, somewhere around 1985, the National Library began strategic planning. That was when this new director, Donald Lindbergh, came. And there's a book over there that I forgot. You can, well, hold it up later. That is a book talking about the National Library of Medicine from 1985 to present. It just was published 2 months ago. And talking about Don Lindbergh and the strategic planning and what it looks like now. In 1985, the collection was literature. It was books, it was scientific journals, a lot of them, obviously, with 50 miles underground. And the searching was done by trained medical librarians using MESH, the medical subject headings. So and it was only for people, for the most part, who worked in health sciences institutions who knew about it or could use it. And you would, as a faculty member, go to the library, talk to the librarians, and they would help you figure out what are you searching for. And they would write all of that down. And then they would get online and they would search, and then they would give you a printout. And if you wanted to change that a little bit, you had to go through the process again and again and again. And then if you finally tried to get the things, they would either be local or not. And it just was a long, involved process. But I think that's what we all went through back when we started using libraries for anything other than a book in a regular library. So the strategic planning involved 120 professionals from around the country, including Nobel laureates, called to do a visioning exercise. And they said, what is the world going to look like in 20 years? So that from 85, that would be 2005. So that's still 15 years ago. And what library services are needed, what infrastructure would be required, and what are the windows of opportunity to make all of this come together and move this institution forward and get us out of the system we're in into the future, whatever the future was envisioned. So they came up with several different 20-year visions, but they decided that they would have systems that would enable the retrieval and integration of information from disparate electronic resources. Now that's really a big thing, that you can actually retrieve and integrate things like patient records, the biomedical literature, knowledge bases, and biological and research data. That really spans a very large spectrum of information, and that you could put it all together. So that was their vision. And they also stated that the most fundamental barrier to the application of computers in medicine is the lack of a standard language. So if you call it high blood pressure, the computer doesn't know that hypertension means the same thing, or that a systolic reading that's over 50 is too high. I mean, all of those kinds of language things pulled together. And back then, I was actually told to help teach the medical students to use computers. And there were a whole bunch of people at that point in medical school who said, we will never use computers. That's not for us. So they have several major initiatives, and I'm going to talk about 5 of them briefly, and then show you what's going on today at the library. The first major initiative, and it was considered the highest priority, was to get a handle on biological databases. The number one biological database was the genomes. It was at the end of the 80s that the National Human Genome Project was launched. That was considered the moonshot of the biological sciences. And no one could figure out how it is that we were really going to ramp up sequencing all of this information and storing it and retrieving it. And so the National Library of Medicine said, we need to take that on, even though we don't know how to do it either, but you know, we do storage and retrieval. They created the NCBI, the National Center for Biotechnology Information, and that was done as an act of Congress signed by President Reagan in 1988. So all of these things, when Bill was talking to me about how you get these things done, you get the president on your side and you get the Congress on your side to make these things happen. So NCBI has this mission. I know it's wordy: design, develop, implement, manage automated systems for collection, storage, retrieval, analysis, dissemination of human molecular biology, biochemistry, and genetics. That's a lot right there. And then perform research into advanced methods so you can analyze it, represent it, and analyze it. Enable persons engaged in research and medical care to use it, which is another biggie. And coordinate efforts for this on an international basis, not just national. So that was a big bite out of the cookie, and that was their number one priority back then, and it's paid off in the long run. Their number two priority was vocabulary and language linkages, which we had talked about before. So that got them heavily into semantic networks, computational linguistics. And they linked a lot of these things together. I know that we get into acronyms here, but this is the systemized nomenclature for medicine, clinical edition. So now billing systems had been automated years and years before, because billing obviously in hospitals and clinics was a big deal, but the clinical aspects of what's going on were not. And part of it was this: you needed a systemized nomenclature. And then you needed information for laboratory data, which is LOINC, and RxNorm, which is prescription drugs, and pull all of those together into something called a unified medical language system. And that now has been also gone into biological sciences and genomics and you know, all of those various other things that we were talking about. And in Obama in 2008 said that they need to be working with the National Coordinating Office for Electronic Health Records. So that kind of launched the library into a direction which they had wanted to go, but you needed the president to say, let's do it. And other people to say, okay, if they have to do it, we'll let them do it, as opposed to putting up roadblocks. A third major initiative was a faster, more secure internet. And we all think our internet is too slow, but back then it was much, much slower. So one of the Clinton-Gore initiatives, of course, was faster internet. They had HPCC, High Performance Computing and Communications, and the director of NIH, and of course, National Library, insisted that that has to include the health sciences. Well, the health sciences at that point were a very, very small portion of computational data. The computational data sat with all of these big guys. So there's the National Oceanography and Atmospheric Administration, National Institutes of Standards, EPA, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NASA, NSF, all of those were the ones who did big computing. It certainly wasn't healthcare, and it wasn't biology at all. Might have been physics, but not biology. But the president made Dr. Lindbergh for 3 years the director of the National Coordinating Office for HPCC. And so all of a sudden you had an opening so that you could start thinking about shipping X-rays across the internet, which you couldn't do before because the images were so big, or pictures of dermatology images, or EKGs, or all of those things in addition to just simple Word documents. A fourth initiative was growing these international collaborations and collections. And that involved a whole lot of politics, as well as more acts of Congress along the way. So clinical trials is one of them. They were funded and authorized by the Food and Drug Administration Act of 1997, FDAMA, the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act. And it said all clinical trials that were sponsored by pharmaceutical companies or by any research institutions like National Institutes of Health, of course, National Cancer Agency, any of those, had to be registered in a single database and available to the public to know about. That was big. And the fifth major initiative was actually serving the public, consumers in all walks of life. And it took President Clinton in 1997 to agree that other people other than health science professionals and scientists could actually access this stuff, that it should be for the public and not just for people in their ivory towers. So you can get access to it all at this point. Of course, it takes a bit to figure out what to do with it. So those were kind of the 5 major initiatives back in the 80s when it all started. So let me go on to what does NLM do today. It gathers and curates all genomes for all species, synchronizes those daily, worldwide, and the other 2 places that work with them is Japan, where gets all of the Asian specialists there, and all of the European stuff goes through the UK. So those 3 centers synchronize all of these genomes and all of the related database. So you start with genomes, RNA and DNA, and then you go forward from there in terms of the biochemistry of the world. It develops computer tool sets for analysis and exploration, and it curates clinical vocabularies for electronic health records worldwide. So all of the vendors around the world and the companies, especially in Europe, where they have nationalized health systems, use these same clinical vocabularies throughout all of that. Now, you'd think that you could then link your records to ones in England, but it's the linkages that don't happen. It's the clinical vocabularies get synchronized, but the actual methods of storing the files and the databases underneath it is not synchronized. Someday it may be, but you can only do so much. It also supports adverse events from chemicals, toxins, emergencies, and environmental disasters, including sending people to earthquake zones and helping them figure out what spilled when and how to go about fixing it. It still gathers and curates this literature. You still have books and journals and web-based literature, and they coordinate 6,000 medical libraries in the United States through a national network of libraries of medicine. That includes hospital libraries and clinic libraries and et cetera. links all of these together via underlying infrastructure tools that I kind of hinted at along the way. And it's free. Now, that was a major revelation in all of NLM's information, because Clinton agreed to that. It was part of what was called the Paperwork Reduction Act of the government. Does anybody here remember the Paperwork Reduction Act? There we go. Which was really, I mean, it was trying to make lemonade out of a lemon. And well, it worked in this case. It said if they access it over the internet, you don't have to register users. You don't have to keep track of who does what. You don't have to have all of that rigmarole in the back end, and you can save money. So they said that access to their resources would be by the internet, the public internet, not a private network, and by anyone who wanted it. Here are some recent NLM announcements. Now, I am subscribed to an email system from the NLM sending out announcements, and I can't show you how to search these things or anything, but I thought you might be interested. Over the last few months, these are things that I've gotten and thought you would be interested in that it does. Here's clinical trials. I'm sorry I don't have a date on this. When I clipped it out, I forgot that, but it's a database of privately and publicly funded clinical studies conducted around the world. And one of the things I often do if someone talks to me about a rare condition or something they're concerned about is I'll send them to clinicaltrials.gov and say, look to see if there's a clinical trial that you can sign up for so you can be part of research and it could help you. And at this point, they have 415,000 research studies, all 50 states and 220 countries. There's pandemic support. This came out in April. NLM introduces a new tool in support of ongoing pandemic response. And they're talking about launch this week, SARS-CoV-2 variant overview, interactive web resource supporting the identification of emerging variants. And the fact that all of these genomes from all of these organisms, including RNA viruses, were in this one database meant that within a week of sequencing the SARS-CoV-2 genome, you could run it against this database and figure out, oh, look at that, it's a coronavirus and it's new. So it really has speeded up biomedical research and obviously public health and patient care. Here's one on clinical genomics. It says that NLM collaboration improves standards for reporting clinical genomics variants. Now, what that means is that you, as a person who goes in to see your physician, and they think you have a genetic disorder of some sort or another, or you just decide you want to get your genome done, you will get a laboratory test. The test will be reported out as a genome variant and will end up in your electronic medical record. So it takes you all the way from laboratory testing and genomic data all the way into clinical records. I was working on that one actually when I retired. And here, this is long, but let me walk you through it. Genomes and proteins. I love this because it says, look at that, we have 24 new species for these things. And here's a monocot, you know, that's a plant, monocotyledons and dicotyledons. The Bactrian camel, should you wish to know its genome. Here's a clouded yellow croesus, which is another plant. Small Madagascar hedgehog, a beetle, a ring-tailed lemur, Jeffrey's cat, crab-eating macaque, etc., a badger. So you could go in, computational, comparative genomics is a big research thing these days. And you could decide you wanted to see what was similar about a ring-tailed lemur with a Bactrian camel. And, you know, could go in and search those databases and do some little analysis and figure all of that out. Maybe next year, she says. And they also, they fund National Library of Medicine awards nearly 58 million to advance data-driven research workforce. This is the training programs that I was telling you about. That'll be over the next 5 years. There's 18 institutions. And it really, it says, through this investment, NLM is continuing to build a well-trained, data-driven research workforce for the future. And here's another one, use of artificial intelligence. NLM is a leader in using AI to improve user experiences. They do a lot of artificial intelligence work, focused specifically on the kind of things that they're involved in. Medline Plus is a trusted health information for you whenever I want something which is consumer health related. I will get onto Medline Plus because they have all kinds of information which is focused on public health or the public and written in public language, not in medicalese. So here's one that comes from the CDC about air pollution. Here's another one, memory loss among caregivers. I was a caregiver for many years. I didn't necessarily like that one. However, it's a great resource, and I recommend you could use that easily. But if you want to check out books on paranoia, the librarian says, they're behind you. So today you have the National Library of Medicine, where their services are woven into the very fabric of 21st century science and 21st century healthcare both, and public health infrastructure with the WHO, CDC, healthcare delivery services like telemedicine, computerized health records, health education of all different health professionals. And all of this has brought up lots and lots of discussion about ethics, decision-making, clinical alerts, big data science, very dynamic field. And it's called informatics. What is a library today? And this is the National Library at least, but the collection is accessed globally by the internet. It's not sitting in a room. And it's not controlled by a librarian who says you can do this or you can't do this. It's stored globally in a distributed fashion, so not everything has to be in the same place. And you've got modern tools like artificial intelligence, data mining, semantic networks to help users figure out what to do and how to get around. And it also is non-traditional and disparate, which is exactly what the National Library said they wanted to go for when they started 35 years ago doing this strategic planning. So at least the NLM right now has all of these things: genomes, chemicals, proteins, standardized vocabularies, data sets, in addition to all of the traditional things as well. The music and the images and the books and the publications. The collection as a whole then is an interconnected knowledge of mankind. Libraries have changed, and what they are now are the core of our lives, and it really is the case that you're connecting to libraries when you get on the internet as a whole. Libraries of email, libraries of books, libraries of news articles, etc. They are the core of our lives, and they organize the knowledge of the world. How much does it cost? At least for the National Library of Medicine, it's free. Oh, except it's funded by the government, of course. But it actually used to cost you every time you did a search and went to talk to a librarian, it would cost you something. It doesn't cost you anything now. It costs you by your tax dollars. And here's a librarian saying, I said, I can remember the old days when silence meant silence and you could hear a pin drop. But of course, if you go into a library, what you're going to hear and see are people using their computers. Ray Bradbury says, without libraries, what have we? We have no past and we have no future. And the last one is my Santa Claus slide. The boy says, I want books, computers, and the ability to travel through time and space. And Santa Claus says, okay, here's a library card. And I think instead of a library card, what you get is your internet access and your Wi-Fi password. I do have some references and acknowledgements that I won't go through, but that's the National Library of Medicine at the NIH. And I thank you very much. Sure, any questions? Yes,
You
Paige.
said not all the information is stored at
At one place,
library.
that's right.
And that it could be anywhere. Who owns that? Who owns the stuff that's not at the library? And
Well, it, of course, she says, who owns the stuff? It's not at the library. It's owned by a whole different group of people. It's interesting to think about who owns it. But if you can access the British Library, it's owned by the British Library. And if you access the your own email, it's owned by you, although it's stored at Google someplace. Maybe someplace in Loudoun County on their web services. So it doesn't matter so much anymore who owns it. It does matter how you can get access to it. And I can tell you, the publishers of the world, the book publishers, journal publishers got very, very, very upset when the Congress started demanding that if we fund this piece of research, then the results from this piece of research have got to be available to the country, to the public. And the scientific publishers, journal publishers said, no, 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 that's our business model. And so that there's been lots and lots of debate about ownership and so forth. Yes, John.
You mentioned part of the future was artificial intelligence.
Yes.
What do you perceive? How is that going to be used?
Well, artificial intelligence, of course, is a computer term that is hard to define. It's if you go back to the original definition of that, starting, I don't know, I got into it in the 70s. It was if you could make the computer think that they were talking to a person and it was really talking to a computer, it was artificial intelligence. But there are a variety of computational methods which are considered artificial intelligence. So that if you use a computer to add and to do your bookkeeping, that's a standard approach, which is not artificial intelligence. If you use it to look at a paragraph and parse the meaning out of that, that could be considered an artificial intelligence, because it's like you who have to look at that and it's not straightforward. It's gathering information and organizing it in your mind. So there's a bunch of artificial intelligence approaches that are mainstream today, that they don't call them that so terribly much anymore, but they're in use. Mike.
Have medical schools integrated the new capabilities of the National Library of Medicine into their curricula? In other words, do physicians in training, especially family physicians, do they learn how to use some of the tools that are available through the NLM?
Sure. So he asked whether or not physicians in training, and then I would say nurses, physical therapists, et cetera, do they learn how to use this? And the answer is yes. They didn't used to. In fact, I wrote a series of articles in the 80s about how you train physicians to search the literature for something that is, they see a patient and they need to search for this. And so it was a big deal back then. It's not a big deal now. They use it as a standard method. They certainly are trained how to do it as best you can, but most of the physicians and nurses and physical therapists and occupational therapists and everything else who are coming through school today, they grew up with this.
Yep.
So it's not new to them. And now they don't necessarily know how to connect a genome to an electronic record, but that's still kind of in the midst of the research basis. Yes.
Maybe a hard question, but I'll ask it anyway. We hear a lot about disinformation these days. How do we know when something goes into the National Library of Medicine that's legitimate or possibly fraudulent?
Well, so he's asking about disinformation and how do we know whether it's fraudulent or legitimate? And that's definitely a good question. The library itself had a committee that I think still goes, which reviews if you want your journal to be in the collection of the National Library, you had to get it approved by this group, which was a panel of experts, which would say this journal publishes good stuff and they can back up the stuff they published with good solid science behind it. And then they also have had a website review committee when the web first really started coming out that looked for the it was like a stamp. I'm trying to remember what it was. I don't know. I can't remember the name of the whole thing, but it was saying this website is a legitimate website and has true information on it. So when they started Medline Plus, it was only with that information on there. Now things flow into Medline Plus that are coming from what they consider legitimate sources. Now, does that mean that there aren't fraudulent things in there along the way? You can't guarantee that everything is okay. But if I go to a National Library of Medicine site, I never question whether it's solid information or not, because they really try hard. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, Joyce. Kent Hammacher.
Yes, Kent.
I'm thinking that there's a plus and a minus to all of this.
Yeah.
I'm a member of Kaiser Permanente for decades. And let's say I left Loudoun County and I went to Ohio and I got an automobile wreck and I was injured severely. People there would need to know what they could do for me based on coming back to my medical records, knowing my genomes and knowing all the diseases I've had and the medications I'm on and what have you. And they would have access to that and be able to treat me appropriately.
Yes.
On the other hand,
That's the goal now.
Beg your pardon?
That's the goal. It doesn't,
Yeah.
I mean, we're still getting there.
The people, the entities who don't have my best interest at heart could access that and use it against me. How is that controlled?
Well, it's there's a whole lot of security systems which are set up that has to do with who gets access to your electronic medical records. And it's all related to the health systems. Gosh.
All the HIPAA rules.
Well, the HIPAA rules, yeah. HIPAA is Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, the HIPAA rules, the privacy rules, it is very seldom, well, I guess I shouldn't say very seldom, but most of the electronic records are set up so that if you want to say who had accessed your records, you could find that out. And if there's somebody in there who doesn't have a particular working relationship with you, like your physician, your nurse, your pharmacist, your physical therapist, or the billing clerk, of course, then you can say, who is this and why did they have access to my records? People have gotten into lots of trouble. So if I guess if Brenda goes into Loudon Hospital, she is such a prominent person as the president of Torch Club that everybody at Loudon Hospital will want to get in and see what's wrong with Brenda. So but there are folks who have gotten into lots and lots and lots of trouble when a prominent person hits a major medical center, and all of a sudden everybody wants to say, oh, what happened to President Reagan? Or why is President Clinton in here? All of those things, they get into trouble because they monitor that big time.
They would like to think it's personal and confidential, but there are ways and means that people.
Well,
use to get to it.
yeah, there are ways and means, and it's also the case that, some of these things, files get out, and you can't.
It's a reality of the current world.
It is a reality of the current world. Well, it used to be worse, she says, Beth says, with charts, that charts would go all over the place. Yeah. Yep. Mike,
One other,
wait, you're next.
another question about doing research using the NLM collections. One of the advantages of the old-fashioned library is if you didn't know how to do research in a particular area, you talked to the librarian.
Yeah.
And you had a professional to help.
Yes.
It's great that the collections are free, subject to security, and open to the public, but without knowing how to do the research on the collections on a collection by collection basis, it seems to me that it would be very difficult for
Yes.
a layman to come in and do it.
Yeah, that's right. That's why you go to graduate school.
I love it.
Is there a shortcut to
Well-
No, there's not.
Yes, there are short courses.
Is there training or-
Yes, there's training. There are a series of short courses. There are YouTube tutorials. There are lots and lots of hands-on things. And there are librarians who can help you with that, who have been trained to help you with that. Yes. Nancy Downing is the last
I
questioner.
just was gonna make a comment on what Kent was talking about, I don't know if it's better today or worse, but my mother used to talk about, she grew up in a small town and the doctor would go to cocktail parties and have a couple drinks and
Tell
share
everybody.
information about everybody, to everybody in the town, so.
Yeah,
um,
it's
I
true.
think it might be better today than it was then.
Well, it might be and it might not be. It all depends upon the individual and, who they are and who they talk to and how does the word get out. So, well, we need to wrap up here, Brenda says.
We're supposed to be out of here by 9. You don't want to get charged extra. We have 6 minutes. Anybody else
No,
have
it's 6
questions?
minutes after 8.
Joyce, if we have
Oh,
questions.
after 8.
come to you.
We've got
sure.
plenty of time. Who else? I'm sorry, I thought it was after 9.
No, it's after 8, but we're finished. Thank you all. Thank you.
Wonderful speech. Most of us, especially those in the literature and other fields, social studies, this is above our heads. But it was very interesting. It's a changing world, that's for sure. And Joyce is right on top of it. Anybody else have questions? I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure that we get out before we get charged more. Yes, Mike?
I would just, as a non-officer this past year, I would just like to thank you in particular and all of the other officers and all of the people who have made this year work well. I think you've done a marvelous job.
Thank you so much. That's very nice. We've worked hard, Anne and Charlotte and Murray and Chris have all worked extremely hard to make this successful. Please look for new members. We can be bigger than this. It's not that we're not happy with what we have, but you know, they're missing something. I'm sure Chris has wonderful programs planned for next year. In June, as I mentioned, we will have hopefully a party right out there on the patio and no program, and it's just going party, party, party. So we'll let you know. Thank you. Does anybody else have another question for Joyce?
I wanted to just say one more thing about this book. And I would loan it to people. It's my only copy though, so you'll have to give it back. It's called Transforming Biomedical Informatics and Health Information Access. Don Lindbergh and the U.S. National Library of Medicine we had the book party a week ago downtown DC, and just came out, and it really talks about all of these major initiatives and how things work today.
And Joyce was an honored guest, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, I tried to pay my money and they gave it back. That was amazing. Amazing. Okay.
Thank you, guys. Enjoy them. All right, we're finished.
Well, thank you very much. You know, it's, I kept thinking about how I was gonna talk
Hard
about
subject, actually.
technical things to a
Nice
non-technical
for your little,
audience.
your jokes. But I'll bet that's what most of the artificial intelligence is for, is helping people look things up.
Look things up
Using
and
expert systems
figuring
and
it
stuff
all.
like
That's
that,
right.
right.
Yeah. You bet.
Wonderful.
Very nice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Those are neighbors at the research center. At the Jamelia.
Oh, yeah, they use all of these things a lot. Yeah, they contribute to them, they contribute their data sets and everything else, and then they use it all the time. You can't do science without using it today. You can't.
That's very cool.
Okay, Bill. Isn't that amazing? Did she stop it? I stopped, well, I paused it, but because I didn't have the question and answers in there.